about on the recent research strategies, methodologies, approaches that emerge in the historical studies, historical research on collective housing. This series is organized in the frame of the PhD program in architecture, history, and project that is related to the seminar, to the course that we held with Filippo, the Pieri, and in the frame of the cost action European middle class mass housing. So before starting, we wanted just to remind to our PhD students that at the end of this series of lectures, we will have a last meeting only devoted to PhD students, where we will try to discuss the main research approaches, methodologies, research practice that were presented, discussed through this series of 4 lectures. As we did last week after the talk by Miles Glendinning, we will today ask Sandra Parvu to share in the next, who will be our guest, to share in the next days one article, one essay, or an introduction to a book of the book chapters that can help you along with the recorded lectures to prepare the discussion for the seminars and to write the critical note that you will be asked to submit before our meeting scheduled on October 7. Now I just want to start, sorry, the registration.
Okay. L'ho fatta partire io prima, nel
grazie.
caso, però se vuoi.
No, allora a questo punto teniamo. I unshare the screen and I share, okay. I want briefly to introduce Sandra Parvu, who is a friend and a colleague from the École d'Architecture Paris-Val de Seine, the National Architectural School, and a research fellow at the Laboratoire d'Architecture et Anthropologie at Paris-La Villette. I think all of you already know her book titled Grand Ensemble en Situation, Journal de bord de quatre chantiers, that was published in 2011 by MetisPresses. We already had the opportunity to meet Sandra twice, first in the frame of our PhD program on the last edition of the seminar organized with Filippo, but also in the frame of the cost meeting that we had, our first cost meeting that we had in November in Israel, in Haifa, when Sandra gave one of the keynote speech. So starting from a series of recent research developed also by Sandra, today her talk will interweave different investigations, different publications, but I think it's important for all of you, and I'm addressing now in particular our PhD program, the work she conducted, the investigation she conducted for her book that explored the relations, the dialogue between political frame, political motivation, and the research on architecture in the construction of post-war collective housing in France. So I will not waste other time with the presentation. I will give the room to Sandra, and please tell me when I have to change a slide. So sorry, I want to, okay. Can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, as we did last week, we will have the talk, and then we will devote to the last part of our lesson of today to the discussion, both with our colleagues of the cost action and with our PhD students. Okay, so thank you, Sandra, for accepting the invitation.
Yes,
and we can start.
Thank you to you and to Filippo as well. It's always nice to see you, even though through shared screens. What I was about to do, and I really hope I'm not too much of a disappointment, is to go back on an old research, which is that of the book, which also was a PhD before becoming a book. And the way I thought I would do it is to share with you a few personal experiences and problems I encountered at the time, and maybe a few conclusions also that stem from that time, but in a kind of retrospective way. The reason I realized that I felt like for a methodological seminar I would go so much back in time is that personally the way I work is, and that might have to do with the fact that I'm not really trained as a social scientist or as a historian, but just as an architect. And so my method of starting to do a research is not really having a method, and it's only after having done the whole process that I can turn back and see that there are a few things that I learned from doing what I do in, I guess, some people call that a heuristic process. I don't know if it deserves such an educated name, but so to me it was a very kind of fertile experience to look back after so many years to what had actually happened during that research. And also I thought there might be some PhD students in the room, and they might face some of the situations I faced at the time, and through simple sharing of the experience that might make them feel better prepared for confronting these type of situations. So what I will do is I will focus this talk on half of it, I would say, is probably put into a larger historical debate, the topic of the talk, which is principally, as the title announces, the question of what it is to gather primary sources while writing the story of post-war collective housing. And the second half will be more dedicated to the personal experiences and how they relate to that a larger debate, but how they also don't, and how one might have to come up with one's own theory or method of how to work in the present situation. So bear with me. There's going to be a bit of a more referenced first half, and the second half is going to be more my personal sharing of experiences. So why the question of gathering primary sources? Well, first of all, let me say that, you know, not being trained as a historian, I must admit that at the time, none of what I'm going to talk to you about was part of my education, or it's something that I discovered as I went along. And of course, the question of gathering primary sources is probably one of the most important. How one does that is one of the most important things that a historian is trained to do. But not being one, I didn't really come with all that luggage. And so just to understand a little bit what I'm talking about, I would like to present in very few words the book that Gaia has already introduced. So Gaia, if we can change slide now. So that's the cover of the book, and on the right you have the 4 chapters. The way the research unfolded is that, as you said, Gaia, the main purpose was to bridge or close a gap between 2 disciplines that had been separately dealt with. On the one hand, you had historians of architecture that had talked about or researched post-war collective housing, modernist discourse and whatnot related to a larger field that might be called history of architecture. And on the other hand, there would be institutional historians, historians of institutions, of administrations, of French politics, and that had discussed the regional planning and all the turmoil and change that came after the Second World War in France. And what I felt was maybe missing was the way in which architects handled or dialogued with the main body of people that were giving them a lot of work at that time. And so the period, and again, you know, that I chose the period, I didn't know that. That was also something that historians do a lot, is identify, in French we call it periodisation. I don't even know the word in English, but it must be periodization, I guess. I identified the moment in which the dialogue was the most potent was at the end of the Fourth Republic, when France was losing the war in Algeria, so a whole reconfiguration of its territory, of its mental representation of its territory, of its national identity, and also the return of Charles de Gaulle to power. So with the Fifth Republic. So the years were end of the 50s and the beginning of the 60s. And to me, in the history of architecture, that also represented a moment when architects lost their place in the discourse on the design or the urban dimension, because it had been taken over by an administrative machine, but somehow they hadn't quite yet realized it. So it was a time when it was a lot of misunderstandings, a lot of fights, a lot of sorrow as well. And out of that came a lot of written archives, which gave me plenty of material with which to document and understand what was going on. In some way, you know, when things are happy and easygoing, there are not that many traces of on which to work. So that's the context in which I slowly came to understand that that's what I wanted to do with this PhD. And so the book is declined. It tells the story of the construction of 4 different building sites that were huge construction operations of housing many thousands, hundreds of thousands, most often housing units, and they were all stories of catastrophes. They're all disasters in some way. And while trying to tell the story from the various different perspectives of all the players, and when I say players, not very little inhabitants, just on the one side, the people who were financing the operation, the political kind of background, and on the other side, the architects and engineers that were designing and building these operations. But while trying to get all of that into the story, I decided that each chapter was going to be somehow focused or told from the perspective of one of the players. So the first chapter was from the point of view of the architects Georges-Henri Pinguisson and Le Corbusier. It was on the last unité d'habitation that Le Corbusier built in France, in Brie-en-Forêt, the 4th one, I think. And then the second chapter was told from the perspective of a minister, of the Minister of Construction of Charles de Gaulle, who's Pierre Sudreau. And so it was told from the national political scene or stage. And chapter 3 was from the very local point of view of 2 mayors who, on whose commune, on the border of whose commune, they had a common boundary, and the housing estate was built on that boundary, which was part of the politics at the time in order to weaken regional or local decision making. And it's kind of failed, because then there was a 3rd commune that was created out of the construction of this. So it was all from the very local politicking and exchanges. That was chapter 3, and the last chapter was from the point of view of a landscape architect called Jacques Sgard. So what I wanted to focus this primary sources gathering on was about this thing that, you know, when you write the history of post-war collective housing, you actually implies that you know, it's recent history. So somehow, you know, there are people who are still going to be alive, maybe for not a very long time, but they are still alive. And so as a result, it's to write the history of collective housing, which necessarily, you know, happened, you know, fairly late or recently in the history, is in some way to write or as part of a history discipline that is now known as, I guess in English we call it contemporary history, but it's very mistaken, because in French contemporary history, that's going back to the French Revolution, and I actually think in Italy as well, maybe, I don't know, but in France we call it, or it has been coined, as écrire l'histoire du temps présent. And strangely, now I'm telling you about things that I found out since having finished long ago my PhD. The writing of the present tense, of the present time, or making the history of present time or contemporary history, is actually, at least in France, it's something that came very late to be recognized as something that was not just sidelined and undermined. There was an institute that was created as a CNRS lab in 1978. Actually, it was properly installed and recognized in 1980. Of course, there were, in order to lead to that institutional recognition, there were like Lucien Febvre and other very much established French historians who had pushed for that agenda, but in some way it was it's something that came fairly recently, that became really part of on question somehow, that this was something that could be done very recently in France. And while preparing this talk, I found that in 2001, so that's less than 20 years ago, that was at the time when I was writing my PhD, there was François Bédarida, who was the first director of this Institute of History of Present Time from 1980 till 1990. He wrote an article in order to, as he says, I'm translating, you know, lift the cloud cast over this part of the discipline that is contemporary history. So, you know, even at the beginning of the 21st century, there was still, and he addresses the critiques that are made to writing about a period that is so recent to the present, and the problems posed by it. So it's still somehow ongoing. And if we can change the slide, what I would like to show you are just a very, very few, but of course, if one looks on the Anglo-Saxon side of things, there's a huge amount of literature. But in France, I would say there's probably a few one can pinpoint, you know, a few historians that have really looked and thought about what the problems of writing contemporary history might be. And so 20e siècle is, for those of you who might want to look back into some references, is the journal that was created by the Institute of Histoire du Temps Présent, and so they publish on various themes. This one is about cities, but all sorts of different things related to the production of the lab. And on the left, there's Écrire l'histoire du temps présent, which was something once François Bédarida retired. It gathered it kind of took a time to organize a conference and invite historians that were close to reflecting about what it meant to write about present time again. And most of the things that I will tell you probably come from various articles that are edited in this book. And then there's Christophe Poumians, who's a, well, originally Franco-Polish historian, and he has more specifically also reflected on this question. There's an article inside, there's a chapter inside the book sur l'histoire that's called De l'histoire, partie de la mémoire à la mémoire, objet d'histoire, initially published in 1998, but republished in this book. You can find it. So if ever you need to go back to more thorough referencing of what I'm talking about, these are pretty much the three publications that are worth looking at. So according to Dominique Schnapper, who was a trained historian, but who later became more of her PhD was in sociology, so she's somehow between these two fields. There are three things that distinguish contemporary history from writing different or history of past periods. One of them is that we don't know the end of the history or the story we are about to write. And she gives the example of, Dominique Schnapper, it might be interesting for those of you who know a bit of the intellectual setup in France, is the daughter of Raymond Aron, and Raymond Aron was famous for writing about communist, well, USSR politics and history in the 70s, 80s. And she says, you know, of course, the way he wrote about that history, or he made that history, is very different from the way we do it now after the 90s. And in some way, we know the end of the story. And to me, that resonated quite strongly, because in some way, at the time when I set out to do the PhD, I was writing the history of these 4 building sites, or at least I was researching or trying to understand what had happened, because in some way I felt that by telling the story differently from the way it had been told so very many times, I might change the end of the story, which at the time looked like everything was pretty much going to be demolished by a national program financed massively to make all these structures disappear and be replaced by some more architectural recent precepts. So, so the question of the end of the story I could totally relate to, because it seems that as contemporary historians, we not only don't know the end of the story, but we might feel that through our work, we might change or modify a little bit the way the story is going to end. And I don't know how, again, not being a purely trained historian, I don't know how receivable that is, but that's how it felt at the time. The second point is that we touch upon things that can still be part of an actual political debate. And she gives the example of a historian who at the beginning of the 80s gave a talk at La Sorbonne about the French resistance. And she tells the story of how he came with his archives, basically his documents, all the things he could gather, and told that story. And in the audience were a lot of resistance still, who had lived that story and who felt that he wasn't giving or doing justice to what had happened, because he wasn't telling a clean, so to speak, story of how brilliant resistance in France had been, but was going into all the problems and disagreements and treachery that went on. And so it was a very heated debate about the fact that there wasn't an agreement about how to tell the story of something that they had lived. And I don't know if that's something that some of you can relate to, but I found as any PhD student, I would give a few talks during those years about my ongoing research, and of course feeling quite vulnerable in some way, because it was something that was in the process of being made, and it was also a first research. And in front of me, it happened very, very often. I mean, actually, every single time there would be someone who would say, no, that's not how it happened. And, you kind of come with your documents and your articles and your references, and in front of you, there's someone who will say, no, this is not what public housing is about, or this is not how it was built, or there's always someone who's there to tell you that actually, and also to derail the research from something that's somewhat has a way of building up or constructing a point of view through proofs and some form of credibility, and in front of that, there would be someone who would be very polemical and bringing it again into a kind of heated political debate about whether one should demolish or not demolish these structures. And of course, in France, you might think, okay, well, that was a huge. I mean, at the beginning of the years 2000, it was huge debate, and lots of blood went to people's head, but about it. But I want to tell a story. I hope it's not too anecdotal, but after I finished my PhD, I was hoping to get a position at Cambridge University, and they invited me for an interview, and it was right after the PhD. And so part of my talk to be hired by the institution was about my research, and I couldn't believe it, but in front of me, I mean, everyone was an academic, everyone knew the rules of the game somehow, and there was this guy who just went, a historian actually, who went up and said, no, but me, I went to see Robinson Hood Gardens, and I talked to the, and it's not good, you know, these buildings, we should demolish them. It's like, I couldn't believe how even through some, you know, in a very coded environment, there would be this breach of something that would be more polemical and political than actual sharing of the results of a research. So I could totally relate to what Dominique Schnapper was saying as the second point. And the third point is the question of oral sources, to which the Institute of History of Present Time has been mainly contributed, which is why also the references are very much related to that, in the sense that what she says, that one of its main conclusion is not so much that we are doing a new form of history, but we are dealing with a new type of sources. So why a new type of sources? Of course, I'll shed aside all these, you know, videos and cinema and new kind of types of, that's not necessarily what I would like to talk about today, but the main thing is, very plainly put, is the fact that the people who have lived the events that we are about to write about, and try to make sense, are still, for some of them, alive. And hence, what is it to be done with this double source, if one can call that, or at least, you know, on one hand, there are written archives, and on the other side, there's the memory of people. There are generally sources that are spoken, and so what relation, what status, what how can one integrate both things into a research and make sense of it, or should one dismiss one of them, or etc., etc. And of course, the question of morality and this type of source also belongs to social sciences, and it's not by chance that a lot of sociologists and anthropologists have also somehow contributed to the debate. But in fact, this question, as I discovered later, taps into a debate that I would say is almost intrinsic to the discipline as a whole. It's not necessarily even something that has to do only with contemporary history. And for that, I will go to Pomian, who has beautifully, in this article I was mentioning earlier on, described a whole history of how the discipline went from being something that was not really a discipline, but just storytelling, towards being recognized as a science and as a moral science. And to put it really in a nutshell, for what he explains is the way in which, in order for history to move away from just stories very well told or narratives that were slowly from 15th century to 18th century gradually criticized because they were subdued to the perception or the sensitivity of the narrator, rather than something that one could actually share and discuss. So slowly it moved from that to something that were what we've come to agree are the material objects that could be considered proof for making history something that actually produces knowledge. And so I invite you to read this chapter, because he really explains in great details and with many examples how through the invention of printing, the text, the circulation of text, started falling into the hands of people who actually could contradict what you were saying, whereas before, you know, through manuscripts, it was generally kept in the hands of the people who produced it and carefully circulated or not circulated at all. And so when text started being getting a much wider readership, one could contradict the authors, and so slowly things had to start being proved, and one had to become credible as an author. And in order to do that, that's how this whole machinery of material objects and letters and proof and dating and all the work of the historian in order to back up his story became part of the profession. And but anyway, I'm not telling this detail, I don't really go into too much, but what happened is that by the 19th century, there was this complete break between, on the one hand, almost literary authors that were not really considered to be historians anymore, and on the other, people who were serious historians because they were using material objects to prove what they were saying. So the dismantling of these 3 centuries of kind of moving of the discipline from one end to the other created this gap where basically, you know, that there was no possibility to integrate both types of sources because they were somehow antinomic of one another. So that's why also that explains in some way how we, in the second half almost, or at least in the 20th century, there was a kind of reconsidering of or valuing narrations as primary sources as a possible way of writing history. So this being said, I don't know how I'm doing time-wise. This should have been the first half. Yes, we're in the first half. Yes. You guys are still with me. It's so weird to be talking to my PowerPoint and not see you, but I hope you're still alive. The second half. So what I want to talk in the second half is to try to relate these issues through the experience, to revisit the experience of integrating or meeting people who were still alive into the research I was, on the other hand, doing mostly in archives. So there are, I should have entitled it the 3 old men. There were 3 old men that I met as part of this research, and I must say, they were really like, one could say, beacons in the dark of how it was for me to enter this world of historians and of archives that I had never before really practiced or put into application. And if we can change the slide, Gaia, please. So the 3 old men. The first one was Jean-Pierre Bourreau. I mean, in no particular order, but first chapter was Jean-Pierre Bourreau, who I will tell you about in a second. And then there was Pierre Sudreau and Jacques Gare. So I will start with Pierre Sudreau. Next slide, please. I have already introduced somehow. So Pierre Sudreau, you see him here. It was maybe on the poster as well that circulated. He's at the exhibition that he, he's the Minister of Construction of Charles de Gaulle. You see Charles de Gaulle on his left, and they are at this exhibition called Demain Paris, which was commissioned by the Minister of Construction. It was about how to territorially rethink the position of Paris and the Paris region at the scale of the whole nation. And you can see on the left and the right, there are panels that map that out, or diagrams. So Pierre Sudreau, if we could move to the next slide. Let me just describe how all this happened. So I discovered that there's this thing that everybody knows if one's a historian, but the Ministry of Construction sent at the end of when it was a change of government, sent its archives, or what came out of its offices, to the contemporary archives that used to be in Fontainebleau at the time. Now they're in Pierrefitte-sur-Seine. And so I decided to take the train and go all the way out in Fontainebleau, and there were it was so weird, there were only one shuttle in the evening to get to the archives, so they had their own personal way of taking you to the archives, and then in the evening you'd go back out of the archives through that shuttle. So you're somehow prisoner of this super mega huge building in which there were only, I think there were not even COVID or anything, but there were only 8 historians allowed at the time, because the reading room was very small and the archives were huge. So I was surrounded only with historians, and who were very methodical about everything. And I just kind of somehow stumbled upon I knew that there was this Minister of Construction that had to be responsible, because it was at the height of at the time there were 300,000 housing units built every year in 54, 55, and by 58, 59, there was 600,000 every year. So there must have been someone behind deciding and sending out directive and all sorts of juridical apparatus and to build all that stuff. So it happened to be Pierre Sudreau, and so I asked to see what came out of his office and his boxes during those years, and I looked at it, and then I had this very kind of dilettantic reflex, which was to Google who Pierre Sudreau was. And so I Google Pierre Sudreau, and what I find is this first image on the left of the passport photo, and realize that he's before being a Minister of Construction, he was mostly a resistant. During the Second World War, he had had some high responsibility. He was, as you can see from the rest of the images, he was, which I found only later, he actually gave them to me. He was very much kind of involved in the post-war politics of France. As you can see, he's with Khrushchev, and then also Pierre Sudreau is with Gaston Defferre, who was also a resistant. So his whole network and way of functioning was based on that, on the relations that had been built during the war, that were mostly trust relations. And so I looked at it, and then I realized that Pierre Sudreau is still alive, and I had no sense of why it was that maybe it would be helpful to meet him, and what possibly more he could tell me than what was in the archive. I had found in the meantime a survey that was very useful. He had surveyed 11 building sites, and they had all sorts of parameters of judging of their success. So the whole thing became the material for the chapter. And irrationally, I decided that I had to meet this guy. He was still alive. I had to meet him, and so eventually. Found his number, found his office, found him, agreed to meet. He agreed to meet, and so he said, but before we meet, please send me a questionnaire of what you want to ask me. And this is the next slide. I faxed him the questionnaire. It was all very structured, as you can see. And then he said, great, let's meet in a restaurant. It's like, okay, let's meet in a restaurant. And there he was. He was already quite old, but fully compos mentis, and it was in the west of Paris. It was very white tablecloth, and so we sat down, and I was still quite young. I was a bit impressed by meeting the Minister of Construction of Charles de Gaulle, and also the thing that seemed incredible is that. To me, this he was like he was like he was like the continuation of a historical presence somehow, that was completely loaded with all the past, and that I thought had been a world that was completely lost. It was as if he had been somehow transferred from a world that I didn't think possible to have lived at the same time. It felt like these movies about time where things happen that, you know, kind of meet people but out of sync. And it's that's something that I mean, I imagine that one could as a historian reflect upon, is the way in which I had this personal, it brought me back to a personal experience, which was that having spent my childhood or was born in Romania, and then when we became political refugees and passed on the other side, there was a complete cut with the world on that was part of my childhood, and when the wall fell, it was incredible to see that actually the people who were on the other side of the wall had continued living, and they were still there. But it was, for me, it was something that couldn't have possibly continued to exist. So the breaks, the way these people travel in time, if one can say so, was a really maybe one of the first lessons that I found very few people write about, even in this gathering, or talking about, you know, primary oral sources, is really taking into account what it means to meet someone who's from somewhere that's lost. I mean, he used to tell you he never answered any of the questions that were in my facts, and I don't even know why he asked me. He just had it was like traveling in time in a world that he was still very much wanting to be part of the political debate. At the time Sarkozy was in power, he told me what he thought about it and how he led the country, but there was this sense of just entering another world. And so what that brought me, I wouldn't have thought at the time, of course, was that when I went back to read his archives, as well the ones from the ministry, as well as his personal archives, the correspondence about construction of these estates, it was very much about hearing him write these things and understand a little bit what ethics, what culture, what energy infused his decision making, in a way that if I hadn't met him, it would have been much more. One could, you know, given the actual political context, which I feel has changed drastically, one could have thought that he was fairly cynical about the way he decided to acquire certain land in the midst of nowhere to put people there, and that it was very much about moving population and for economical purposes, and disregarding the human dimension entirely, etc., etc. And in some way, having met the person enabled me to read into his words from a different time, or from his writing, to interpret them or to read them, to cast a different light. But in terms of actual oral sources, there's no trace of that whatsoever. The second old man, if I can ask you, Gaia, to change the slide. The second old man is Jean-Pierre Bourreau, who's in the middle of the image, the tallest man. He was the engineer of Le Corbusier, site engineer, on two very important operations. One of them is here, you see it at the Brazil Pavilion, and the other one is for the Unité d'Habitation in Brie-en-Forêt. So Jean-Pierre Bourreau was a completely different story and relation. So if we can change again the slide, I went to the Unité d'Habitation and was lucky to find this association that was defending the interests of the building from an architectural point of view. It had been going through the possibility of being demolished as well. So this association was created, and I found this photographic album, and Gaia, if I may ask you, I think your little arrow is blocking the caption, so maybe some of you can't really read.
Sorry, I just moved it.
It's still there, but I don't know why. If one can click on something else, because if some people need the reference, I don't know. So I found this photographic album that was documenting, very closely documenting the construction of the Unité d'Habitation. And so I looked through it, I understood certain things were useful, but nevertheless I was interested in finding out who the author was, and the people in charge of the association told me that it was Jean-Pierre Bourreau, and that Jean-Pierre Bourreau was still alive, which I thought was fantastic yet again. So I called him, and again, he was very happy and willing to meet, but being an old man, I had to go see him again somewhere where he was, and he happened to be in the west of France, next to Nantes, and again, a different way of traveling in time. I would go to his house, and his wife, we couldn't meet. I had to meet him a few times, and we couldn't meet without having wine and shrimps and lunch with his wife and everything. And then he would kind of sit down, and what I did was, because one couldn't take the photo, he had donated the photographic album, so I photographed, if we can change slides, I photographed every single photograph and put it back into order. And can we change slides, please? And showed them to him and asked him to comment most of them, so which was obviously very helpful, because even though I'm trained as an architect, there were certain things that that escaped me, and that he explained in full detail about, also certain decisions that had to be made, choices at the time on site. He remembered all that perfectly well, and I thought, well, this is good enough. And at least there's some information coming out of this. And then what happened is that, if we can change slides again, at some point I found these images that here I have reorganized, because they were not next to each other, but one can see Le Corbusier appearing on site and with lots of other people, and I got a sense that there was something going on there, and indeed there was. The Le Corbusier only came once on the site, and I was very unhappy about quite a few things, and the date was on it, the 5th of April 1960, and so that was, for me, it was like a moment of, resolving the beginning of resolving a murder mystery, because the archives related to the construction of the Unité were scattered throughout national, but also local and regional archives, and of course Le Corbusier's archives and La Fondation, and so now I had a date, and I knew that somehow a lot of the issues that were related to the history of this construction and what had completely gone wrong could be told from this turning point in time, when before the 5th of April, in preparation of the visit, there was a huge amount of exchanges between Le Corbusier and the Ministry of Education, and because there was a kindergarten that was supposed to be built on top of the roof, like in Marseille, but also with the Ministry of Construction, etc., and after the visit as well. So a lot of the claims and misunderstandings between administration or the whole political play at the time, and Le Corbusier and Georges-Henri Pindusson as well, who was the architect, responsible for the urban master plan, all of that came into somehow a huge jigsaw puzzle, of which I had found the logic, or the kind of the key, or a way of entering. And the last old man is, thank you, is Jacques Gare, who you see here in his office. And yeah, I'm very fond of Jacques Gare, because he's still alive. Everyone else, so both Jean-Pierre Bourreau and Sudreau, passed a few years after I met them. So I would go see him about La Courneuve, which was undergoing massive demolition at the time, and you can see on the right with Christina Rossi, who's an anthropologist from the lab. We took him back on this site to see if in some way some things might come back to his memory, because the first time I went to see him, he said, it was really one of the first projects in my career and I can't remember anything, and I think I have burnt or thrown away all documents related to the project. So I thought, wow, that is quite, I mean, it was kind of, it wasn't even borderline anthropology anymore. It was almost psychology. I didn't really know how, I felt even less armed to deal with what possibly he could tell me about the project. So I still felt that there was something to be told or something to be learned from meeting him. And as you can see, in his office, there's no computer. There are all these rulers in the back. And I would go see him, and he had this kind of way of diluting time. I would go for 2 hours, and I felt like I was in a time capsule, having traveled through, again, a world that I didn't think possible to still, a parallel world that I was really still thinking existed. And so the one thing that remained with Gaia is that, if I may ask you for one of the 2 last slides, Gaia, is that he actually was spent a lot of the interviews that we had together talking about memory, because of course La Courneuve was in some way a doppelganger, a reflection of what his project had done to his own memories. It was in the process of being completely erased. And so he reflected a lot about memory, as you see here, a parenthesis on memory. He was teaching at the Landscape Architecture School in Versailles, so he was with his students on an industrial side, and so the students were supposed to investigate the plant that was supposed to be demolished, and in the process of doing that, of visiting the site and looking at the site, they also met workers that had long retired. And so he says that when they asked the workers what to do with the site and whether one wanted to keep a memory of it, they replied, oh, well, we've had enough of this memory. No, you can demolish everything. We left our lungs here, so we are wary of memory. And so he commented, but on the other hand, an interesting thing for students, they understood that one could evoke the past in other ways than by keeping things, and that there, the memory was the river, it was the Bruges, it was the driving force, renewable energy by excellence with its turbines, these channels, this diversion. And he continues, memory is an interesting thing, but rather evocation. And so memory was not literal. So in some way, he contributed to, without really, I didn't really expect it, but I did integrate it in the end in the chapter. It was a kind of put in perspective something that, on the one hand, you know, the question of the doubling of sources, the relation between memory and archives and history was the domain of historians, but then him as a designer, he also was, it was important to see or to acknowledge the fact that he was also involved in a reflection as a designer of what it meant to, like he says in the last chapter, in the last paragraph, sorry, while if there's history, it becomes identity. It's no longer just memories that disappear with people. So he had a different entrance and a different read on how to articulate these two things through projects. And one last quote that I feel might conclude the talk today is, I, who am an old man who had our family house demolished during the war, the whole town, moreover, the whole district of Calais, in fact, when I go back, there's absolutely nothing. Even the streets, everything has been transformed. It is funny, in effect. So memory now is in a corner of my childhood, but there's nothing left to evoke it on the spot. So for those whose building is removed, I can see how it creates a shock to them. So I went to interview him about the construction of La Courneuve and its present demolition, and he replied with something that was part of his own experience and life. And I thought that was quite powerful, and that was also something to do with not only reflecting about how to integrate oral sources or articulate oral sources with written archives, but also taking into account this very specific thing, which is that of interviewing people who have lived over 80 years and who have a perspective on time and the passage of time that is quite peculiar, and that I felt was quite interesting to integrate as part of the research. I thank you very much. And I haven't bored you too much. I have no idea, because generally when there are real people in front of me, I kind of hear whispers or something, but couldn't really take into consideration that. Sorry.